Pardon the interruption. I'm Amy Poppinga. Sam, did you know that this is National Sports Cliche Week? Any favorite sports cliches?
Actually, Amy, I'll do one better. I smell a montage coming.
We're just taking it one game at a time.
There are no moral victories.
A win is a win.
We're going to have to be ready to play because you know they will.
It's us against the world.
I care about winning. I am not concerned with individual honors.
We needed this loss in order to focus on what we're trying to do.
We're going to have to plan our execution and execute our plan.
We just need to go out there and execute.
She's good at making plays in space.
He's a high motor guy.
Defense wins championships.
Nobody believed in us.
At the end of the day, it is what it is. Welcome to PTI, boys and girls. I'm Sam Mulberry. Amy, welcome back.
Thank you.
We had a couple webisodes without you. I think your absence was definitely noticeable.
I think so as well.
It's
at
great.
least from the letters I received.
That's right.
When are you coming back?
So you were in Japan.
I was.
So
yeah.
Before we jump into CWC, any highlights from the Japan trip?
Yeah. Well, I mean, in a few words, Japan is a great place to travel. It is an incredibly efficient society. So as far as getting around, the rail system is amazing. The thing I loved about Japan, and we'd been told this, but anytime we looked confused for more than maybe, 30 seconds, some very kind person would come up and offer to help us and usually actually physically take us to wherever we needed to go. There are tons of amazing different types of snacks and treats in Japan. There are literally pop machines and vending machines on every corner that have a whole variety of things. I'm not the most adventurous eater, so there were a few days where pretty much I only consumed potato chips because I'm not a huge seafood fan. Probably my favorite day was a day when I was looking at the potato chips, and because I cannot read Japanese, could not decide between the two flavors that I had the options of. One of the bags had lobsters on it. The other bag had mountains. I chose mountains.
What does mountain taste like?
They taste like lemon.
Of course.
Of course they do. Yep.
So Amy, we had our first exam this past week.
Oh, we did.
What are any takeaways you have from the first exam?
Yeah, so first of all, overall, I thought the exams went very well. So people seemed prepared. I think the main thing is just once you've got one in the bag, you're much more familiar with the timing of it and how that works. So definitely if you didn't see where the timer was or you weren't sure, then make sure that you just set your own timer so that you can kind of keep track. And remember that as much as there's a benefit to sort of being able to check your work and make sure that those objective questions are right, you really need to be cognizant of that tends to slow you down. It takes extra time, and then you really don't have the time that you need on the essay. So I want to make sure you do well on all portions of the exam. So really just keep in mind that essay is going to take more time than you think, and kind of plan accordingly.
And actually, that leads to my biggest piece of advice, and I wrote this on a couple people's exam, is it's okay to start with the essay.
Absolutely.
I think sometimes we get really worked up
Yep.
about getting everything else perfect. You get to the essay, and I had a couple students who either ran out of time or you could tell they were kind of rushing through it.
Yeah.
And my sense would be, let's write that essay first. Let's get that, because that's the biggest. I mean, it's only 30% of your exam, but it is the biggest.
Absolutely.
The biggest.
Yep. So you're kind of worried about missing those objectives because it's so obvious to you that you've got these things you're going to miss. But at the same time, you could miss quite a few objective before you would, with the trade-off of the points you're going to miss if you end up only being able to put out a few sentences on that essay.
Anything about the exam essay specifically? Any advice you would give?
I think the main thing is, and this is probably the same advice I would give just as we continue to do the reflections, is really look at, are you answering all components of the question, and really are you being specific? Are you using examples from the material, not kind of speaking too broadly? And when you give an opinion or you're going to make a statement, back it up. Doesn't mean you have to write paragraphs and paragraphs, but if you're going to make a comment about why you do or do not agree with something, you need to make sure that you are kind of demonstrating that your opinion has been shaped by what it is that you're studying.
And the best way to do that is if you can pull something from the reading, all the better.
Absolutely.
So when you go through your reading packet, highlight stuff
Absolutely.
or have a list of quotes where it's like, okay, here from the Plato reading, here's 4 quotes, or if I have to write an essay, I'm going to try to pull one of those.
In.
That's going to make, because the students who did that, their essays were so much stronger.
That's so true. And one just quick comment too about connection questions, because that's the other thing is I would just say is make sure that you're thinking about the stronger connection. So there's lots of things that the two ID terms might have in common, but really push yourself to say, but like, what would they talk about in a conversation? So not just sort of the obvious, like they're both philosophers, or even like they're both males. Think about like, but if they were actually sitting down and they were having a conversation, what would it be that they would either be in agreement about, arguing about, contrasting one another? So really kind of push those connections a little bit further.
Mm-hmm. Amy, as we move into Unit 2, we are looking at the Middle Ages. One of the big developments of looking at the medieval world is the rise of Islam. So when Christians think about kind of the origins of Islam, what are the big misunderstandings that...
I think that one of the main things that we either aren't aware of, or that in some cases we actually kind of like to try to avoid, is the shared history of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So all three of these comprise what we call the Abrahamic tradition, that all three of them tie their roots back to the prophet Abraham. So when you're studying Islam, you are not studying something that sees itself from the perspective of looking at it as a Muslim who's looking at their own history. You aren't thinking of yourself as a religion that is completely separate and completely new. Foundational to Islam is the notion that there is one creator God, and that there are three traditions that have worshipped that one creator God. And so Islam does not sort of happen in a vacuum, and it's totally different than what were the sort of existing beliefs in this notion of the one creator God. So there's some commonality to be found there that I think is really helpful for Christians when they're learning about Islam or trying to understand it. I think the second thing, and obviously this is what we're covering right now when we are studying the development of Islam, is that Islam is not new. So, and what we will see is, we won't go into great detail about it, but that Islam historically has lived quite comfortably in diverse societies. So in connection with both Christian and Jewish communities, and that Islam has not always been at odds with other societies, whether that comes down to religious differences or differences in government structure or social issues and things like that. And then I think just the third thing I would point out is that when we think about Islam, even though it has its roots in Arabia, which is what we're learning here, Islam is not a monolithic religion, that the vast majority of the world's Muslims today are not from what we can call the Arab world, but that instead the majority of the world's Muslims live in Southeast Asia. We have a strong and large Muslim population in the United States, in Canada, in South America, really everywhere. So to not, even though it has its roots in the Arabian Peninsula, to not think of Islam as just sort of being like an Arab religion or specifically just tied to one cultural population.
And I would have one other thing. I mean, you talked about how the Islamic religion grows out of the Abrahamic tradition. The Islamic culture is also an inheritor of this classical Greco-Roman tradition. So whenever I teach about Islam, that's one in this course. That's one of the big things I want to impress upon them is it's not just folks in Western Europe who pick up this tradition, but it's also core to that, especially medieval.
One of the most interesting conversations I have at some points in classes with students about Islam is that we will study, coming up in our last unit, where Christianity and science come into some tension with one another, like how do we arrive at truth? Islam, although that has been a question at certain points, Islam has always had a much more flexible and open relationship with science. And the idea that all truth is God's truth means that when we discover truth in nature, or whether we discover truth through philosophical approaches to answering questions, that these are other ways that God reveals himself to us. And for that reason, the writings of Plato and Aristotle were incredibly influential on early philosophical Islamic thinkers. And in fact, it is Muslim scribes who retain and write much of these original texts, preserve them in Arabic so that they can later be translated back into Latin. So it's a really interesting connection there.
So shifting gears a little bit in terms of the Middle Ages, we talked about medieval Islam. As we think about medieval Europe, I'm teeing you up for one of your favorite things to pound home. But one of the big things that students tend to struggle with or misunderstand is feudalism and manorialism as separate systems that work together. So
this is also a great dinner party conversation starter. So you will be the one that can clear up the confusion between these two. So I think the easiest way to distinguish them, and there's obviously many characteristics then that we need to be able to flesh out, but that feudalism is a political system, we can say, and manorialism is an economic system. But they work together, so you can kind of overlap them. So back in the days of using an overhead projector and overhead sheets, we'd be able to take our feudalism sheet and we would just be able to put our manorialism right over the top of it, and they would fit together really nicely. But if we want to start with manorialism really is the economic system that would affect all of society. So the vast majority of societies at that bottom level that you read about, where they are serfs and peasants and they're kind of at the bottom of the food chain, as we call it, and then above them they are usually living on a manor and the lord is over them, and then the lord over the lord is a king who kind of has dominion over the whole area. If we lay our political system of feudalism on top of that, we have these exact same sort of characters, but we have the added roles of knights who are offering protection to lords in exchange for being given land, but everybody still is subject to the king. So make sure you can kind of distinguish between those two. That's just a quick overview, but if we just focus on those ideas of political and economic, kind of helps you organize them better in your head.
And I think we tend to think about the Middle Ages as this sort of distant thing, and especially in terms...
You do.
Okay, I do. And it's especially in terms of Christianity, we think of medieval Christianity as just a really almost foreign land to explore. When you think about medieval Christians, what do you think they have to teach contemporary Christians about Christianity?
I think that, and even in some of the responses that I've already read of people who turned in work last night, I think one of the really intriguing things that appeals to us right now is actually this sort of idea of kind of like taking a step back, pausing, and really thinking about what does it mean to be in a place of obedience and worship, and how do we think about worship differently? And one of the things that I know that in continued studies of teaching, of the Middle Ages from teaching CWC, one of the things I really value is the whole idea of like forcing quiet, like introducing quiet in a whole variety of ways, and the notion of, while I know that I love God and I know that I feel like I'm a person who is devoted to God, do I really incorporate that into my life in terms of devotional practices or into forms of obedience that are the same way that I would approach good health and making healthy eating choices, or exercise, that I know that when I make exercise a daily part of life, even when it's difficult, even when I don't feel like it, I'm focused on the fact that but it's a commitment to myself. And so one of the things I love about the Middle Ages is this exploration of what does it mean to sort of, within the monastic model, live this life of obedience to things that don't sound, quote, very fun to us, but that this is actually an act of worship. This is a form of worship. So don't confuse it with the notion of like works above belief. That instead what you're doing is that you are literally saying, I'm practicing worship through the way that I'm going to conduct my body and my interactions with others, and forcing myself into a place of quiet so that I can really hear from God.
I think the things that I would point to are kind of related. The first has to do with a really kind of communal sense of religion to a certain degree. And part of this is, as we'll see when we talk about the Protestant Reformation, that grows up in a time where we're starting to see individualism on the rise, sort of post-Renaissance, as we move into the Enlightenment. So I think that sometimes Protestant Christianity has a little bit more of that individual part in it, where the medieval church, there's a little bit more in terms of, I mean, especially when you look at monasticism, things like that, there's really a focus on community. But the other piece of that comes in this idea that the ideal of medieval Europe is that everybody's a Christian and everybody's part of the same church. So there's a kind of unity.
Yes.
And I realize that that's problematic because there's really not unity, because you have Muslims and you have Jews and you have other non-Christians living in Europe. But at least there's this sense of unity, and I think that's something that's a pretty powerful thing to think about.
Yeah, it contributes to a notion of shared values, that it's like, that what's sort of organizing society, whether, and we certainly know that there were Christians who were sort of Christian in name, but behind the scenes are not, necessarily practicing many of these things. But at the same time, there is the shared idea that this matters, and that this is something that governs life, and that belief in God is something that is central to every aspect of society. And there's definitely got to be some kind of unity that comes from that.
All right, so I feel like I'm asking you a lot of questions in this segment.
That's
because you've been gone for us. This is like Amy Poppinga Hero Ball. We're just feeding you.
And I've got a bag of mountain chips ready for when I get too tired here.
All right, we'll be right back.
All right, welcome back. I join Amy while Sam recovers from all those questions he had to ask you. It's a lot of work. So this is segment 2. This is the fun segment. This is the game segment in our webisodes. And again, we're going to play Make the Case. So Amy, you were not here last week, so I'll refresh your memory. Plus, just in case anyone didn't watch last week, I'll refresh their memory too. In this segment, one of the ways we want to review the previous material, and so in this case the Middle Ages, is to have each of us take turns making the case for or against different people, and essentially to compare their significance is often the recurring theme. So this tends to be mastery, vocab, reading, as we've talked about. And then you students will vote on who wins each of these 3 cases. So last week, I defeated Sam 2-1, so Sam gives way to Amy. Your turn to take on to see who's king of this very, very small metaphorical mountain. All right, so I will start, and we'll work through 3, and then students, you'll have a chance to vote on Moodle. So Amy, let's make the case. Thomas Aquinas is the greatest Christian theologian since Augustine, or Augustine.
Or is he?
Well, we'll find out here. So you will argue first, I believe.
No. No, he is not.
It's a heartfelt answer there.
Yeah. Yes. Wow. Yeah.
Or I can go first if you'd rather.
Yeah, I would.
Because I'm
prefer
making the
that.
affirmative
I
case.
prefer that.
So sure.
Yeah.
Thomas Aquinas is the
That only
greatest
seems fair.
theologian since Augustine. I mean, I think we want to think about the magnitude of something like the Summa Theologica as a work of systematic
haven't read it. It's not very popular.
theology. I mean, because even Augustine never really does write a systematic. I was just reading a review of a new work of systematic theology by an Episcopalian woman, and Augustine writes all these shorter pieces. His longest work is The City of God, which is really about political theology. He never really sits down to try to answer to, put all the pieces together of who is God, what does it mean to be human, how do we live in this world. I mean, this is really the first great Christian attempt to have a theological system that coheres, and it takes seriously everything that had come before it. If you read through it, he's answering, here's what Augustine said, here's what Origen said, here's what Scripture says. And it's a really powerful work. So even if you end up disagreeing with his conclusions about what is the sacrament of the Eucharist and transubstantiation, even if you disagree with his idea of how the church is structured, I mean, you still have to respond to it. I mean, to the extent we kept saying in the first unit that all of Western philosophy is a footnotes to Plato, I almost want to say all of Christian theology since the 1200s is a series of footnotes to Thomas Aquinas, even if you're like a Protestant who disagrees radically with him.
I didn't like his haircut. No, I think that there's certainly no denying that Thomas Aquinas is an important figure in the development of Christian history. In terms of, is he the greatest theologian since Augustine? I think there's reasons that that's problematic. Number one, if you put this in the context of the Middle Ages, we certainly know that this is a time frame where there's going to be a long extended point in history where people aren't able to fully engage these questions, or if they are engaging them, writing isn't being communicated and spread in such a way that you are getting to really get your point across to others where they can be debated or enriched in thought. Aquinas has the benefit of the fact that he is writing in a time where he has been able to benefit from education and he is able to have the time to engage in scholarship. So I don't know, this is a tricky one. I mean, in terms of most significant, I'm going to argue, I'm just going to kind of go with like we just don't know. I think that that's the best case that I can.
It's kind of hard. I mean, one way of responding, well, here's another more recent, more significant. We haven't quite got there. So
well, that's what I'm saying is that I feel like, well, there is somebody that I can talk about who I think is maybe going to overshadow, and I think you certainly could argue today.
John Wesley.
Yeah, well, John Wesley too. But no, we're coming up here on a pretty important figure.
Very shortly.
Who truly is going to really radically shape the Christian tradition. So I don't feel like I can say too much other than students trust me. Dr. Gehrz is wrong.
I think we call that foreshadowing in the business. So, okay, so that's case number one. You'll get to vote on that. Case number two, Amy.
All right, number two.
So what is our case?
So the question is, Hildegard had a mystical experience with God. True or false?
All right. So I think whoever is true should go first. Does that work?
Fine.
Well, I'm just spreading truth all over the place here. Yeah, why not? I mean, number one, I will say she actually questioned it. Like, she wasn't sure, in her time period, and she wrote to the leading people of her time, and they encouraged her to say yes. So, like, in her time, people who she trusted as being wise, knowledgeable, prudent Christian figures said, yeah, you should trust this. Number two, people at the time listened to this. Like, the reason she's a significant figure is that people in her context took this seriously and like credence to it. And I think it'd be a little bit arrogant of us to say, well, 1,000 years they were clearly wrong, right? And here's the other reason I'd say it's significant is that with every core of my modern Western post-scientific revolution being, I want to reject this and say, no, she was hallucinating, no, there's a chemical imbalance in her brain, no, something else was happening, or she was lying. And I worry about that. Like, I worry that as a Christian, I've closed off the supernatural too much. And I want to disbelieve and explain away anything that doesn't fit that relatively narrow, mechanistic, scientific worldview. And so I want to be open and say, people at the time thought it was true. Maybe I shouldn't be so quick to disagree. I'm going to go out on a limb and say, yes, she had those mystical visions. even if I'm not entirely comfortable with the theology that they reflect.
Yeah, I think it's tricky. People at the time also thought that the sun revolved around the earth, and they believed that to be true. I think that mystical visions are challenging for the exact reason that you suggest, is because they cannot be confirmed. Is there an argument to be made for the fact that God reveals himself to each of us individually in different ways? I certainly think that there is. At the same time, history has proven that some pretty awful and terrible things happen when people fully embrace the idea that God has spoken to them and it cannot be confirmed by others, and then it puts them into an elevated position of power over others who then rely on that person's particular interactions with God. So if we look at equality as being something that's central to the Christian tradition, and that God sort of interacts with each of us equally and doesn't withhold from one what he might share with another, I think it raises some issues. I just finished reading a historical inquiry by author Stacy Schiff about Salem, about the Salem witch trials. And that's always been something that's kind of intrigued me. But one of the fascinating things about that is that there are now some sort of scientific reasons that can be made, a case that can be made for even strange things like contaminated and wheat. So wheat that people would eat that had been left to mold, and that mold actually induces when humans consume products that have molded, it induces hallucinogenic effects. And so we have all of these, we have these records that in some cases are much more fleshed out than the ones that we have about Hildegard's visions. I mean, she's one author. We have these multiple records of people having these hallucinogenic visions, and now several hundred years later, we're able to actually scientifically look and say, not entirely sure that that's what's happening there. And again, in that case, what that actually led to was people being condemned to death and loss of life. So I think we have to be very careful when we decide that a mystical vision has weight. Why isn't this more common in today's society? Why do we not continue to see God speak in this way to people? And we often don't think it's valid. If I were to come to you this morning and I were to say, guess what? God gave me a mystical vision that you were going to wear that shirt today. I knew it. You wouldn't believe me. You would. I
like 5 shirts. So it's a predictable.
Well, that's true. I actually do tend to know what you're wearing. Yeah. But the point is that I think there's good reasons that we tend to be skeptical, often because I will argue there tends to be an abuse of power that is tied to individuals who believe that God has given them a particular type of wisdom that others don't have.
Let me just pick up on one thing you said, that we tend to be suspicious of that today. That is true of we living in certain societies. I would say the majority of Christians in the world might not be as suspicious. Like most African Christians, I think, would actually not be at all surprised. Like in some ways, medieval European Christianity probably has more in common with many African Christianities than it does with...
I absolutely agree with that. And I want to point out, I do believe that God speaks differently to communities according to their context. As noted, this is also a society where people believed that what they were seeing occur in nature and in celestial phenomenon were wrong. Yeah.
I mean, I'd say one really cool thing about the Middle Ages, think that we just started with Aquinas and Hildegard, living not too far apart from each other temporally or geographically, and they seem very different, right? But they actually overlap a lot. Like Hildegard is also this kind of really naturalist, medicinal
That's
figure.
True. Yep.
And Aquinas extols the mysteries of the Eucharist, right? So the medievals don't necessarily think it's a choose. You either believe mystical or rational.
You combine.
They think it's all part of God's truth. Okay, so I suspect that we're 1-1 heading into this. So let's get to our deciding question. Which is the greater medieval invention, the Gothic cathedral or the university?
Oh, finally one I feel like I can be happy with either direction I have to take here. I'm not sure. I don't know how I feel about it. All right. Okay. Universities. Is there any denying that universities are the most important one of the most important medieval inventions? Number one, you can't really vote me down if you're going to vote for Thomas Aquinas, which Dr. Gehrz has argued earlier. So think about that when you're voting. But you think about the importance of universities for the whole notion of this era of scholasticism, for this great combination of being able to combine not only religious study, but also to engage secular study and to be able to bring those two things together. We think about the university system and actually how little in many respects it has changed since its inception. I want to point out that Europe was not the first place to have a university model. But the point being that this has been a system that has worked and that has stood the test of time, and that this greater education brought all kinds of advancements in society, and that those advancements that were brought to society had a leveling effect. So it wasn't just that certain types of intellectual achievement only sort of stayed at that top level, but rather that knowledge, maybe not initially, so it doesn't mean that like all of a sudden everybody got to go to university, but rather the information that that comes out of this rigorous time of study is going to improve society, and those improvements are going to be for society as a whole. Some of our most important religious figures are going to be people who are trained in the university, and it's not only where they've enriched their study, but that they learn to challenge and to question actually some of the abuses that they see in the church, because there's some contradictions that they observe, and as a result we are going to wind up with a reformation that is going to reform many of the abuses and corruptions that existed in Christianity. Okay. And many of those universities, are they still there? Yes, they are. Oh, and where are we? We're at Bethel University.
Okay, so I will start by arguing against what Amy just said, and I want to be cautious, because actually I do think there's something enduring about the university. It's why I'm hesitant to agree with all the disruption of higher education talk. Like, this is actually something that's worked on some level. Now, it also has changed rather dramatically since the 11th, 12th century. Like, our universities are actually based more on German universities of the 19th century, and German universities were almost extinct by 1800. There were only like 2,000 students left in all of them. And you can't actually go to most of these. You can go to Oxford and Cambridge, but like you can't go to the University of Paris in the same way and find it existing, unlike the Gothic Cathedral. And this is fairly striking. Like, now, to some extent, it survives because it's a tourist destination, right? And I don't want to extol that as being a great reason for its existence.
Have you checked European church attendance lately, Chris?
But I think there's something really powerful. And one thing I'm always cautious about, and I said this in our last food chain, is not making this just the history of ideas. Like, there's something very powerful about ideas, and they can even have revolutionary political effects, as Amy is hinting at. They can cause us to question the status quo. But that is not the sum total of what it means to be a Christian. And as a pietist, right, I want to say this is not just about belief and theology and doctrine and philosophy. It's about religious experience and feeling. And there's something really powerful about, even today, entering a Gothic cathedral, even knowing that it's a museum and not an active site of worship. There's something worshipful, and you can understand why thousands of pilgrims went to Chartres, right, in the 12th century. But here's the final thing I would say. It happened last night. My wife and I started rewatching Ken Burns' National Parks, which Amy, as an environmental historian, will appreciate. Katie was looking for something to put her to sleep, and I hadn't watched in a while. So anyway, the first thing they talk about is that in 1851, some white people actually trying to hunt down Native Americans stumbled into Yosemite, misnamed it. Anyway, though, within about 5 years, people starting arriving. And if you watch this episode, what you'll find is the only thing they could compare it to was the Gothic Cathedral. Right? And this is 800 some years after the cathedral is being built. It still had that kind of hold on the Western imagination, so that when they came to these spectacular geological masterpieces, how do they explain it? Well, it's like visiting a cathedral, right? And there's something about it. It makes us understand something about God that nothing else can really convey, except once we start stumbling across these pristine places in the American West. And I think that's pretty powerful. There's nothing that I know that makes me have that sense of kind of the vertical dimension of our relationship with God besides the Gothic Cathedral.
It was a low blow to add the national parks in there, because that one gets me every time. I will say, actually, one of the most powerful, like instantaneous, both religious and appreciative of like the freedom that I have to pursue academic study came in entering the library at Georgetown. So in an interesting way, I think that your argument is so solid, and at the same time, I'm appreciative of the places that have actually sort of combined the two. But well played.
Well played. So that's how we do Make the Case. Please take time to vote on Moodle. And remember, you are going to be making the case. You have a discussion board assignment due tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. Our discussion board discussion this week, you'll be making the case for or against something called the Benedict option. So you can read a lot more about this on the discussion board. We have a link to give you even more information, so I'll just give you the quick version. This has been something that's been proposed by a writer named Rod Dreher for a few years now. It's obviously an ode to St. Benedict of Nursia. You've read part of the Rule of St. Benedict. He founds a monastery out of the ruins of the Roman Empire. And so what Dreyer's tried to do is suggest maybe we're living through a similarly significant kind of transition where Western culture is entering what we're going to be calling this unit an epoch of homelessness. And so he suggests that maybe we should learn something from Benedict's impulse. And he doesn't mean we should all go live in monasteries, but he does mean maybe we need to withdraw from mainstream culture to some extent. And he talks about public schools, mainstream media, but also partisan politics, and say, let's focus more on building Christian community. And so he talks about intentional communities where people live together. He talks about homeschooling. He talks about like focusing more on things like education within your churches and the power of liturgy. And so the problem with this is that he hasn't written the book yet, so it's really hard to know exactly what he means. So what we'll do is we're going to set up 3 threads. One is make the case, yes, we should use the Benedict option. One is no, we shouldn't. And then I'll also create like a yes if or a yes but, because I think there are enough fuzzy things here. You might like some of the concept but not be comfortable kind of saying yes, absolutely, it's great. And so if you want to take that middle path, we'll leave it open. The main thing to underline here that's different from the first board is please don't start a new thread.
Yeah, just really we want to see a lot of discussion, so we want you to really be building on what other people have said, so there's no need to kind of go and start a new one. Rather, let's just kind of keep building on what's already been out there.
And so you could disagree with people, you might build, but whatever you do, please try to advance the conversation, or pick it up really early.
And you can't not reply because you've withdrawn from society, so you do have to reply.
Okay. All right, so let's make the case this week. Okay, Sam, it's happy time. You ready?
I am ready.
Okay, happy 47th birthday to Ken Jeong.
Can it be 47 already?
Amazing. Best known for his supporting roles in Community and the Hangover Trilogy. And I think he has his own show. I just haven't seen it yet. Ken Jeong is not only a comedian, but a medical doctor. He went to UNC Chapel Hill, practiced medicine, then became a comedian. Sam, who is a funnier physician, Dr. Ken Jeong or your father-in-law, Dr. Dale Berry, the pride of Cambridge, Minnesota?
It sort of depends on what type of humor you like. Like I'm a big Community fan, so that's where my Ken Jeong love comes from. Not a huge Hangover fan, but Community, huge fan. But if you really like people who recite lines from old Fawlty Towers episodes, then it's definitely Dale Berry.
Okay.
So that would be my answer.
I like how we build a little Make the Case mini version.
That's right. Chris, happy anniversary to Live Aid, the massive benefit concert held simultaneously in Philadelphia to raise money for famine relief in Ethiopia in 1985.
I knew that you would like this because it's the 80s and it's like celebrity fundraising.
Do you remember Live Aid before we get to the actual question?
Not really.
I remember it.
Okay, I wasn't sure what they broadcasted on. I wasn't paying attention to pop music.
I wasn't like cool at the time to like really be into it, but I remember like it being on in the house.
Oh, it was a big deal.
Yeah, I remember the TV being on and it was on in the house. But here's the question, Chris. Yep. As a musical moment, what is the most important performance at Live Aid?
This is not a hard question because the answer obviously is this is when U2 became U2. Now they only performed a couple songs, but one was Sunday Blood, and like I don't think Joshua Tree had quite come out at this. Like this was their massive like coming out party. The problem is that Sam doesn't like U2 or care about this fact, and so I can't appeal to this.
Oh, I don't mind U2. That's as far as it goes.
That's not the right answer. So like for all like, I mean I think it is important because like. It defines them for better and for worse.
Okay, before you answer this, I think this is where you're going, I hope, is the correct answer has to be some sort of musical mashup where you mix two people.
It is. So here's what I'm going to say. I think it's a fascinating kind of snapshot of the 80s because you've got kind of like the carryover, like it's a reunion concert. Led Zeppelin famously, it was the first time the Who had played together in a while, like Dylan, the Stones, Paul McCartney. Like it's kind of like the 60s are entering their kind of nostalgia phase, but then it's also the 80s. Like Madonna is there and like Prince didn't show up, but he sent a video. So here's the way I'll depict this. Here are 4 acts at Philadelphia. Neil Young, right? So you've got the nostalgia thing. Rick Springfield, Simple Minds, and Run DMC.
Together?
No. So what do they have in common?
What do they have in common?
One important 80s thread holding them together. And so I wasn't sure if you had seen this. So if you'd seen it, you'd probably know.
I don't know.
Okay, they were all introduced by the same person, and that person is Joe Piscopo.
Whoa, crickets.
Yeah. I know. So like that was the most 80s way I could think.
Yes.
Wow. Another favorite introduction thing.
Students don't realize how funny that is.
No, like he was who's a Saturday Night Live person to compare? Like, he's not the best person because Eddie Murphy was on, but it's like Taron Killam introducing people or something.
Yeah.
No, he's not that popular.
It's hard to say. He was very popular and then did nothing.
And then after this, nothing. Right. The other introduction is that Phil Collins was introduced by Bette Midler and Jack Nicholson.
Oh, I need to go watch some Live Aid on YouTube.
Or just read Wikipedia page. Okay.
I want to watch it.
Happy trails to Unit 1 of CWC. Sam, this is kind of a food chain thing. I'll build it. Rank them. What are your 3 favorite units of this course?
All right. I'm going number 3 is going to be Unit 3.
That's your 3rd favorite.
Yes.
Okay.
Number 2 is Unit 2, the one we're going into. So it's pretty good.
It's pretty easy.
Number 1 is the best. Number 1 is my favoriteest unit in CWC.
I thought you were going to tell them about Unit 4. Just kidding. Unit 4. All right. So maybe if that, maybe like that'll be actually food chain and make the case next week.
That's right.
Okay. So please let us know what you think about it. Like any email, like if you want to weigh on your favorite units so far. You only have 2 to choose from, so it's a little bit less heavy lifting than what Sam just had to do right there. Remember, you've got discussion board assignments. Write about the Benedict option. So first of all, go and learn more about the Benedict option, then write something as response to other people. I think we're still willing to accept who's got your backman.
We've got your backman, and we're more than willing to accept.
If not, I actually will have one next week because we're going up to the North Shore, and I will haul it along with us.
I want a photo essay, Chris.
Okay. I'll take it to all the different places. Split Rock, like Grand Portage, Grand Ray. Like
all the Grands.
Right. Okay. So anything else, Sam, to add? I think
that's all I got.
Episode. It was good to have Amy back. Ask her questions about Japan because I'm sure she has a lot more to say. Kids, put away the iPads. We're done.